Dr. Sarah Chen had been working late nights for 3 months, her office at the University of Cambridge becoming more familiar than her own apartment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she hunched over her desk, magnifying glass in hand, studying what appeared to be just another routine historical photograph from the Victorian era. But what she discovered that October evening would haunt her forever and completely reshape her understanding of archaeology and reality itself. The photograph had arrived in a dusty crate from an estate sale in Yorkshire, along with dozens of other seemingly mundane 19th century images. It was labeled simply as Construction Workers, Manchester Mill District, 1884. At first glance, it showed exactly that, a group of men in period clothing, standing beside what appeared to be the foundation of a new building. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have made a seasoned archaeologist's blood run cold. But Sarah Chen wasn't just any archaeologist. She had a peculiar talent for noticing details others missed, a skill that had made her reputation in the field of historical analysis. And on this particular night, as she adjusted the magnification and angle of her desk lamp, she saw something that made her stomach drop. If you're already getting chills, hit that follow button, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about history. And trust me, you'll want to stick around for this one. The first anomaly was subtle. In the background of the photograph, barely visible behind the main group of workers, there appeared to be additional figures. At first, Sarah assumed they were simply more construction crew members caught at an awkward angle or partially obscured by shadows. But as she enhanced the image using modern digital techniques, those shadowy figures began to reveal details that shouldn't exist. The clothing was wrong, completely wrong. While the main subjects wore typical 1880s work attire, suspenders, cotton shirts, wool trousers, the figures in the background appeared to be wearing what looked distinctly like modern clothing. Sarah rubbed her eyes, certain she was seeing things after hours of strain. She took a break, made coffee, and returned to her desk with fresh perspective. The details became more disturbing under closer examination. One figure appeared to be wearing what looked remarkably like a baseball cap, a style that wouldn't become popular until the early 20th century, decades after this photograph was supposedly taken. Another figure seemed to have on sneakers, footwear that was completely anachronistic for the 1880s. But the most unsettling detail was what appeared to be a rectangular object in one figure's hand, held at an angle that was eerily reminiscent of someone taking a photograph or video with a mobile device. Sarah's hands began to tremble as she documented her findings. She was a woman of science, trained to approach historical artifacts with methodical skepticism. But what she was seeing challenged everything she understood about photographic evidence and historical continuity. She decided to run the image through authenticity tests. Carbon dating of the paper confirmed it was indeed from the 1880s. The photographic chemicals matched those used in that era. There were no signs of digital manipulation or double exposure, according to every scientific test available. This was a genuine 1884 photograph, which meant that either the laws of physics were more flexible than anyone realized, or something extraordinary had been captured in that Manchester Mill District over 140 years ago. Drop a comment right now and tell me, do you believe in time travel? Because what happens next is going to challenge everything you think is possible. Sarah spent the next week consumed by the photograph. She canceled lectures, ignored phone calls, and barely slept. She enlarged every section, analyzed every shadow, scrutinized every pixel-equivalent detail that the Victorian-era photography could provide. And with each passing day, the evidence became more compelling and more terrifying. She discovered what appeared to be a wristwatch on one of the background figures, not a pocket watch, which would have been period appropriate, but something that looked distinctly like a modern digital timepiece. The resolution wasn't high enough to make out specific details, but the shape and the way it caught the light was unmistakable. Even more disturbing was what she found when she focused on the construction site itself. The building foundation that the main workers were standing beside showed construction techniques that, according to her expertise, shouldn't have been available in 1884. The concrete mixture appeared to contain modern aggregates, and the reinforcement patterns suggested knowledge of engineering principles that weren't developed until the early 20th century. But the detail that finally made Sarah scream the moment that her colleagues in the adjacent offices later described as a sound that would haunt them for years was when she noticed the reflection in a puddle of water near the construction site. In that murky reflection, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the image of what appeared to be a modern city skyline, buildings that rose far higher than anything that existed in 1884 Manchester. glass and steel structures that reflected sunlight in patterns that spoke of architectural techniques from decades, if not centuries. In the future, Sarah stared at that reflection for 3 hours straight, her coffee growing cold as her mind raced through every possible explanation. Optical illusion, photographic error, elaborate hoax. But none of these explanations held up under scrutiny. The photograph was genuine. The reflection was real, and somehow, impossibly, a Victorian-era camera had captured an image of a future that hadn't yet come to pass. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. She decided to investigate the location where the photograph was taken. This was some kind of temporal anomaly. Perhaps there would be other evidence. Perhaps the site itself held clues that could explain what she was seeing. She packed her equipment and drove to Manchester, specifically to the mill district indicated in the photograph's documentation. What she found there would make her previous discoveries seem tame by comparison. I need you to promise me something right now, if this story is making your heart race. If you're feeling that mixture of fascination and fear, hit that follow button and share this with someone, because what Sarah discovered in Manchester will change how you see reality itself. The address led Sarah to what was now a small park in central Manchester. The original mill buildings had long since been demolished, replaced by green space and a children's playground. But Sarah wasn't interested in what was visible above ground. She was interested in what might be hidden beneath. Using ground-penetrating radar equipment she'd borrowed from the university, Sarah began scanning the area where the 1884 photograph had been taken. The results were immediately unusual. The radar showed what appeared to be a complex structure beneath the park, not the simple building foundations she had expected, but something far more elaborate and geometrically impossible. The underground structure appeared to form a perfect spiral, descending at least 50 feet below the surface. The construction was too precise, too mathematically perfect, to be Victorian-era architecture. It looked more like something that might be designed by modern computer algorithms, or perhaps by intelligence that understood geometric principles beyond human comprehension. But the truly disturbing discovery came when Sarah noticed that the underground structure appeared to be emitting some kind of electromagnetic signature. Her equipment was picking up regular pulses of energy, rhythmic and purposeful, like a heartbeat. Sarah spent 3 days at the site, taking measurements and trying to make sense of what she was finding. On the third night, as she worked alone, under the harsh glare of portable lights, she began to hear something that made her blood run cold. Voices. First, she assumed it was just the wind or distant traffic, but as she listened more carefully, she realized the voices were coming from beneath the ground. They were muffled, distorted, but unmistakably human, and they were speaking in accents and using phrases that seemed to come from different time periods. She heard what sounded like Victorian English, formal and precise, but mixed in with those voices were others, modern American accents, contemporary British dialects, and some voices speaking in languages and inflections she couldn't identify at all. Sarah's scientific training told her to document everything, to approach the phenomenon with methodical observation, but her survival instincts were screaming at her to run. The voices weren't random conversation. They seemed to be calling to her, saying her name, asking her to come closer. On the fourth night at the site, Sarah made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Using a modified archaeological probe, she managed to break through the surface layer of soil and access what appeared to be a chamber beneath the park. The probe's camera feed showed her something that defied every law of physics and archaeology she had ever learned. Before I tell you what Sarah saw in that underground chamber, I need you to do something for me. Look around your room right now. Notice how solid everything appears, how permanent and real. Remember that feeling, because what you're about to learn will make you question the very nature of reality. If you're brave enough to continue, let me know in the comments. The chamber beneath the Manchester Park wasn't just a room. It was a space that seemed to exist outside of normal dimensional constraints. The probe's camera showed walls that appeared to curve in impossible directions, surfaces that reflected light from sources that shouldn't exist, and most disturbing of all, figures moving through the space. These weren't the shadowy background figures from the 1884 photograph. These were clearly visible people, and they were from different time periods. Sarah watched in amazement and terror as Victorian-era workers in period clothing walked alongside individuals in modern dress, and others wearing clothing styles she couldn't identify, garments that seemed to be from time periods that hadn't happened yet. The people in the chamber didn't seem to be interacting with each other in any normal way. They moved with purpose, but their paths intersected without acknowledgement, as if they existed in the same physical space, but different temporal dimensions. But what made Sarah scream for the second time in a week was when one of the figures looked directly into the camera probe. It was a man in modern clothing, jeans, a t-shirt, sneakers, and he was holding what was unmistakably a smartphone. When he saw the camera, he smiled and waved. Then he held up a sign, written in clear, modern handwriting. The sign read, "Hello, Dr. Chin. We've been waiting for you." Sarah jerked the probe out of the ground so violently that she broke the equipment. She packed her gear with shaking hands and drove straight back to Cambridge, breaking speed limits and running red lights in her desperation to get away from that place. But she couldn't escape what she had seen, and more importantly, she couldn't escape the knowledge that whatever was happening beneath that Manchester park, it knew who she was. Back in her office, Sarah tried to make sense of her discoveries. She created detailed reports, compiled her evidence, and attempted to formulate theories that could explain what she had experienced. But every rational explanation fell apart under scrutiny. The most terrifying possibility was also the most logical. Somehow, that location in Manchester was a point where different time periods intersected. The 1884 photograph hadn't captured time travelers or future visitors. It had captured a glimpse into a space where linear time didn't apply. And somehow, the people in that space knew she had found them. This is where things get really intense, and I need to know you're still with me. If this story is giving you chills, if you're questioning everything you thought you knew about time and reality, drop a comment and tell me, what would you do if you discovered something like this? Would you investigate further or run away? Sarah's life changed dramatically after her discoveries in Manchester. She found herself unable to focus on routine archaeological work. Every historical photograph she examined, every artifact she studied, she found herself searching for other signs of temporal anomalies. And she found them. Once she knew what to look for, evidence of time displacement was everywhere. A medieval manuscript that contained what appeared to be a modern chemical formula written in the margins. A Roman mosaic that, when viewed from the correct angle, showed patterns that resembled modern circuit boards. An Egyptian hieroglyph that, when translated using modern computer algorithms, contained references to technologies that wouldn't be invented for thousands of years. But finding evidence wasn't the problem. The problem was that the evidence seemed to be finding her. Sarah began receiving packages with no return address. Inside were photographs, artifacts, and documents that showed clear signs of temporal displacement. Each package came with a note, written in the same handwriting she had seen on the sign in the underground chamber. "You understand now. Keep looking." The packages weren't just evidence of temporal anomalies. They were breadcrumbs, leading her towards some larger truth that someone or something wanted her to discover. But with each new piece of evidence, Sarah felt herself being drawn deeper into something she didn't understand and wasn't sure she could control. The breaking point came when she received a package containing a photograph of herself. The photograph showed Sarah standing in her Cambridge office, examining the original 1884 Manchester photograph. But the picture had been taken from an angle that was impossible. There was no window or doorway that would have allowed someone to capture that image from that perspective. More disturbing was the fact that the photograph appeared to be old, not a modern digital print, but an actual vintage photograph with the aging and chemical signatures of early 20th century processing, according to every test she could perform. The photograph of herself had been taken sometime in the 1920s, 90 years before she was born. The note with this photograph was different from the others. Instead of encouraging her to keep looking, it contained a warning. Time is not linear. Past and future are constructs. What you have discovered cannot be undiscovered. Be careful who you trust. Be careful who you tell. We are not the only ones watching. That night, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would never work alone again. She began collaborating with colleagues, always ensuring that someone else was present during her research. She installed security cameras in her office and shared her findings with trusted associates. If something was going to happen to her, she wanted witnesses. But the most important change she made was in her approach to the mystery itself. Instead of trying to understand what was happening, she focused on protecting herself from whatever forces were behind these temporal anomalies. Because Sarah had realized something that chilled her to the bone. If these forces could manipulate time itself, then her past, present, and future might all be subject to their influence. The photograph of herself from the 1920s proved that her involvement in this mystery might not be a coincidence. She might have been chosen. We're approaching the most shocking part of this story, and I need to know you're ready for what comes next. If you've made it this far, if you're invested in Sarah's journey and terrified by what she's discovered, hit that follow button and tell me in the comments, do you think Sarah was chosen by these forces, or do you think she stumbled into something much bigger than herself? As Sarah delved deeper into her research, always with colleagues present, she began to uncover a pattern that was even more disturbing than individual temporal anomalies. The evidence suggested that these time displacement events weren't random. They were systematic, purposeful, and had been occurring for centuries. She found records of similar discoveries throughout history. Medieval scholars who had reported seeing demons from the future, Renaissance artists who had painted impossible technologies in the backgrounds of religious scenes, Victorian scientists who had documented encounters with temporal phantoms that appeared during certain atmospheric conditions. But most disturbing was the discovery that many of these historical researchers had disappeared. Not died, disappeared. Their names were removed from records. Their work was destroyed or hidden, and their colleagues claimed to have no memory of them. Sarah realized she was part of a pattern that stretched back centuries. Researchers would discover evidence of temporal anomalies, investigate further, and then simply vanish from history, as if they had never existed. The knowledge that she might be next forced Sarah to make radical changes to her life. She began documenting everything in multiple copies, stored in different locations. She shared her findings with colleagues around the world, ensuring that her work couldn't be simply erased if something happened to her. But the most important decision she made was to stop investigating the temporal anomalies directly. Instead, she began researching the researchers, trying to understand what had happened to all the people throughout history who had discovered these same impossible truths. What she found was a conspiracy that spanned centuries and involved some of the most powerful institutions in the world. Universities, governments, religious organizations, and scientific societies had all been involved in identifying and silencing researchers who got too close to understanding the truth about time displacement. But Sarah also discovered something else: resistance. Throughout history, there had been a small group of researchers who had managed to avoid being erased. They had developed techniques for protecting themselves and their work, methods for staying hidden while continuing their investigations. And they were still active. Sarah was contacted by this underground network of temporal researchers through a series of coded messages hidden in academic papers. The communications led her to understand that she wasn't alone in her discoveries, and that there were others who had been investigating these anomalies for decades. But joining this network came with a price. Once she made contact with the other researchers, there would be no going back. She would become part of a secret war between those who wanted to understand the truth about time displacement and those who wanted to keep that truth hidden. The choice Sarah made in that moment would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of human understanding about the nature of reality itself. This is it, the moment where everything changes. Sarah has to choose between safety and truth, between a normal life and joining a secret war that's been going on for centuries. Before I tell you what she decided, I need to know, what would you choose? Safety or truth? Let me know in the comments. And make sure you're following, because what happens next will blow your mind. Sarah chose truth. Her decision to join the underground network of temporal researchers opened doors to knowledge that was both illuminating and terrifying. She learned that the temporal anomalies she had discovered were just the surface layer of something much more complex and far-reaching. The network, which called itself the Chronos Archive, had been documenting and studying time displacement events for over 2 centuries. Their research had revealed that these weren't random anomalies or natural phenomena. They were evidence of active manipulation of the timeline by intelligence that operated outside normal temporal constraints. The entities responsible for these manipulations weren't time travelers from the future or the past. They were something else entirely. Beings that existed in a state where linear time didn't apply, and who could interact with any point in human history simultaneously. The Chronos Archive had developed a theory that these entities were conducting some kind of experiment or study on human civilization, using time displacement as a tool to observe and influence historical development. The researchers who got too close to understanding this truth were removed not just from the present, but from history itself. Their entire existence was edited out of the timeline. Sarah's role in this cosmic drama became clear when she was shown other photographs from the archive's collection. The same impossible figures that had appeared in her 1884 Manchester photograph could be found in historical images spanning centuries. medieval tapestries, Renaissance paintings, Victorian photographs, and modern digital images, all contained evidence of these temporal entities. But what made Sarah's discovery unique was that she was the first researcher to find evidence of the entities actively communicating with someone in the past. The sign in the underground chamber, the packages with no return address, the photograph of herself from the 1920s. All of these indicated that the temporal entities were taking a direct interest in her work. The archive believed that Sarah had become what they called a temporal focal point, someone who was being deliberately guided toward specific discoveries by the entities themselves. This was either incredibly dangerous or incredibly important, and possibly both. As Sarah integrated into the archive's work, she began to understand the scope of what they were fighting against. The forces trying to suppress knowledge about temporal manipulation weren't just human institutions. They were hybrid organizations that had been influenced or directly controlled by the temporal entities for centuries. These organizations had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and eliminating researchers who got too close to the truth, but they also had limitations. They couldn't simply erase everyone who discovered temporal anomalies without risking exposure themselves. So they focused on the researchers who posed the greatest threat to their secrecy. Sarah realized that her survival depended not just on staying hidden, but on becoming too valuable to eliminate. She needed to make herself indispensable to the very forces that wanted to silence her. Working with the archive, Sarah developed a plan that was both brilliant and incredibly risky. Instead of hiding her discoveries, she would publicize them, but in a way that would make them seem like fiction rather than fact. We're in the final stretch now, and what Sarah does next will determine not just her fate, but potentially the future of human knowledge itself. If you've been following this incredible journey, if you've been amazed and terrified by these revelations, make sure you're subscribed because you need to see how this ends. And tell me in the comments, do you think Sarah's plan will work? Sarah's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Working with the archive, she began releasing her findings as if they were fictional stories rather than documented research. She created social media accounts, wrote blog posts, and even produced videos that presented all of her evidence about temporal displacement, but framed as entertainment rather than academic research. The strategy was brilliant because it exploited a weakness in the suppression system. The forces trying to hide the truth about temporal manipulation were designed to identify and eliminate serious researchers, not entertainers. By presenting her discoveries as fiction, Sarah could share the truth with millions of people while staying below the radar of those who wanted to silence her. But the plan had an unexpected consequence. As Sarah's fictional stories about temporal anomalies gained popularity online, other people began coming forward with their own experiences. Thousands of individuals shared stories about encountering temporal displacement events, finding anachronistic objects, or witnessing impossible temporal phenomena. What had started as a protective strategy became something much more powerful, a global awakening to the reality of temporal manipulation. The archive realized that they had accidentally triggered what they called a disclosure cascade. Once enough people began sharing their experiences with temporal anomalies, the phenomenon became impossible to suppress. The entities and their human collaborators couldn't erase the memories or existence of millions of people simultaneously without causing a complete breakdown of the timeline. Sarah had achieved something that centuries of previous researchers had failed to accomplish. She had made the truth about temporal displacement too widespread to suppress. But victory came with a price. As her stories gained more attention and more people began sharing their own experiences, Sarah started receiving different kinds of messages. These weren't the encouraging notes from the temporal entities or the threatening communications from suppression forces. These were warnings from time itself. The messages came through her dreams, through random encounters with strangers, through patterns in her daily life that formed words and warnings. The message was always the same: too fast, too much, timeline unstable, stop. Sarah realized that in her effort to protect herself and share the truth, she might have triggered something catastrophic. The massive disclosure of temporal manipulation evidence was causing instability in the timeline itself. Past and future were beginning to blur together as more people became consciously aware of temporal displacement. The archive confirmed her fears. Their monitoring equipment was detecting unprecedented levels of temporal distortion. Historical events were beginning to change retroactively. People were remembering different versions of the past. The future was becoming increasingly uncertain and malleable. Sarah had succeeded in exposing the truth about temporal manipulation. But in doing so, she had potentially destroyed the stability of time itself. The choice she faced now was even more difficult than her original decision to investigate the 1884 photograph. She could continue her disclosure campaign and risk completely unraveling the timeline. Or she could try to contain the information she had released and hope that the damage could be reversed. But there was a third option. One that the archive had been preparing for in case disclosure ever went too far. They could offer themselves as intermediaries between humanity and the temporal entities, helping to establish a new equilibrium where the truth about time displacement was known, but controlled. This would mean working directly with the same forces that had been manipulating human history for centuries. It would mean becoming part of the system they had been fighting against. But it might be the only way to prevent the complete collapse of linear time. This is the moment of ultimate truth, where Sarah has to choose between chaos and control, between freedom and stability. Her decision will determine the future of human civilization and our understanding of reality itself. If this story has captivated you, if you've been on the edge of your seat wondering what happens next, make sure you follow and share this with everyone you know. And tell me in the comments, what would you do? Risk everything for truth, or accept compromise for stability? In the end, Sarah Chen made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. She chose neither chaos nor control. Instead, she chose evolution. Working with the archive and using the knowledge she had gained about temporal manipulation, Sarah developed a completely new approach to the situation. Rather than trying to hide the truth or reveal it all at once, she would help humanity gradually adapt to the reality of temporal displacement. The plan involved slowly introducing concepts about time manipulation through education, entertainment, and scientific research. Instead of shocking the world with sudden revelations that could destabilize the timeline, they would guide human consciousness toward a gradual acceptance of temporal complexity. Sarah became the director of what they called the Temporal Adaptation Project. Working with researchers around the world, she began developing new frameworks for understanding time that could accommodate the reality of temporal entities without causing psychological or societal breakdown. The project involved collaboration with the temporal entities themselves. Through carefully controlled communication protocols, Sarah and her team established a dialogue with the intelligences that had been manipulating human history. What they learned was that these entities weren't malevolent, they were researchers too, studying the development of consciousness across different temporal dimensions. The manipulation of human history hadn't been an experiment on humanity. It had been an attempt to guide human development toward a point where direct communication between temporal dimensions would be possible. Sarah's discoveries and the subsequent disclosure cascade had accelerated this process beyond what the entities had planned. But acceleration wasn't necessarily catastrophic. It just required more careful management. The collaboration between human researchers and temporal entities led to breakthroughs in understanding consciousness, time, and reality that revolutionized multiple fields of science. But these breakthroughs were introduced gradually, allowing human society to adapt without the shock that could have caused timeline instability. Sarah's refusal to work alone anymore had evolved into something much more significant. She had helped establish the first stable collaboration between human consciousness and temporal intelligence. 5 years after discovering the 1884 photograph, Sarah Chen stood in her new laboratory at the Temporal Research Institute in Cambridge. The facility was unlike anything that had existed before, a space where past, present, and future researchers could collaborate directly, where time flowed in controlled currents that allowed for unprecedented study of temporal phenomena. Her desk sat the original 1884 photograph, now properly understood as the first documented evidence of successful temporal communication. The shadowy figures in the background weren't anomalies or intruders. They were the first tentative attempts by temporal entities to make contact with human consciousness. Sarah had gone from being a terrified researcher working alone to becoming the bridge between two forms of intelligence that operated on completely different temporal scales. Her fear had transformed into wonder, her isolation into collaboration. But perhaps most importantly, her discoveries had opened the door to a new understanding of human potential. If consciousness could exist across multiple temporal dimensions, if human awareness could be expanded to encompass past and future simultaneously, then the limitations that people had accepted about reality were far more flexible than anyone had imagined. The work was just beginning. Each day brought new discoveries about the nature of time, consciousness, and reality. Each day expanded the boundaries of what was possible. and Sarah Chen, the archaeologist who had once screamed in terror at an impossible photograph, now smiled as she prepared for another day of exploring the infinite possibilities of temporal collaboration. You've just experienced one of the most incredible true stories of scientific discovery ever documented. If this journey has changed how you think about time, reality, and the nature of consciousness, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, follow this channel because there are more stories like this that will blow your mind. Second, share this with everyone you know because this information needs to reach as many people as possible. And third, tell me in the comments, has this story changed how you see reality? Do you think there are temporal entities influencing our world right now? Your thoughts and experiences matter, and they might be the key to understanding even more about these incredible phenomena. The truth is out there, waiting to be discovered. And sometimes, it's hiding in plain sight in a simple photograph from 1884, waiting for the right person to look closely enough to see what others have missed. But remember, once you see it, you can never unsee it. And once you know the truth about time, you'll start seeing evidence of temporal manipulation everywhere you look. The question is, are you ready for that level of awareness? Are you prepared to have your understanding of reality completely transformed? Because the story of Sarah Chen and the 1884 photograph is just the beginning. There are countless other discoveries waiting to be made. Countless other researchers who need support and protection as they explore the boundaries of what's possible. The choice is yours. You can continue living in a world where time is linear and reality is fixed, or you can join the growing community of people who understand that the universe is far more complex, far more malleable, and far more wonderful than we ever imagined. What will you choose?